Hey, good morning, Grace. So today is indeed Name Tag Sunday. It's a chance for, and by the way, as I was walking around out there, I saw quite a number of people who said, I really like this. I like that I can walk up to somebody and actually know what their name is, because how often have you walked up to somebody in church and you've had to do that casual, like, hey, brother? And we have some in our church who like to give nicknames to people. Hey, Skipper. So it's nice to have Name Tag Sunday. But more important than Name Tag Sunday for me is if you are indeed somebody who is newer to grace, and I'm using that ER, newer, it doesn't mean that this is your first Sunday. It doesn't mean that you've only been here in February. If you're somebody who's only been around for a couple of months, would you please come downstairs after service today? We would really, really like to get to know you just a little bit, answer your questions about who we are, about our church, about what we believe, maybe share some of our history, but most importantly, we'd love to find out like who you are. And there will be some good snacks down there, so I encourage you to come downstairs after the service. We won't keep you real long, but we really would like to connect with you. And frankly, I think that's probably one of our greatest strengths here at Grace. I hope a lot of it is our doctrine, what we believe, the way that we love. But one of our great strengths is that this truly is a connected family, people who know and love each other, even if we have to use nicknames for one another. All right, couple of things. One, I think Sean asked us to turn and look at the wall back there and wave to one of our brothers who had heart surgery. Last week, we prayed for him after service, and then on Monday, he went in for his surgery, and the surgeon came out and reported that things went as well as they could possibly have hoped for. He had triple bypass surgery. The doctor said that his heart was actually very strong and that he looks forward to a great recovery, and I think the intention, the goal is for him to go home today. Several of us were able to visit him this week, and he was mostly smiles. He was doing well. He was up. He was moving. He was eating solid food. A little bit sore, but I think that's to be expected. So he's doing well, and that's an update on our brother Mike. I also have to tell you there's a correction I need to make. I'm finding that as I get older, and people have told me this was going to happen, as I get older, my thoughts wander, and sometimes I can't locate either names or words that I'm looking for. That happened to me last week, and in fact, it was one of those times it's kind of embarrassing because I doubled down and then I tripled down on one of these events. Did you catch it? I was talking about digging wells. Who caught it? You did? Yeah. Who did I say was digging those wells? Esau, but who really dug them? Yeah, I did. Well, in this particular case, was actually his father, Isaac, that we were talking about. It's not that he's the only one that dug wells, but I doubled down and tripled down and said, Esau, Esau, Esau. And some of you in your brains were going, he's wrong, he's wrong, he's wrong. And so, hey, sometimes you just got to confess and repent. All right, well, we're going to begin today with a question as we ponder this series that is called Called to Love. Right? We've been called to love. We've been called out by God. God has selected you, chosen you, invited you into a relationship, and he's called you to be loved. That's what he wants to do. He wants to love you as a precious son, a precious daughter, but he's also called us to love one another. He's also called us to love the world and express his love to a lost world so that they might understand there is a great God in heaven who loves people and invites them into relationships. So that's really the series. But my question for you all today is this. I want you to turn to somebody next to you and answer this question. Who can you identify in your life that you would say is selfish? Okay, go ahead. Have fun with that. Who can you identify in your life that is selfish? Go ahead. All right. Hey, if you're new to Grace, let me tell you, we do these things partly because I know you don't want to sit there and just have me talk at you the whole time. Sometimes it's nice for you to be able to talk to one another. Today's question is a little bit less theological. Sometimes I ask you deeper questions, but really the idea is to get your brain engaged. Okay, we don't come to church, we are the church, and so we're here to engage with God, and so we want our brains to be engaged. Sometimes it's also fun because I get to watch people having these conversations, and in that situation, it's very, very likely that you are able to turn to somebody in your row and go, actually, now that he asks. I did hear one answer that was great. All teenagers is what I heard. I heard all teenagers. So if you're a teenager, I'm sorry that Sean feels that way about you, but it's just what I heard. It's what I heard. I try to argue and say it's not true. All right, one more time just for fun, and again, to get your brains engaged, but also because it will connect to today's message. Can you turn to somebody nearby and tell them the name of somebody that you know who is mostly selfless? Go ahead and turn and talk to somebody for a minute. Somebody who is selfless. All right, let's draw our attention back to center here. I didn't get to hear a lot of comments, but I did hear, at least in the first couple of rows, I heard one name being thrown out by a number of different folks, and that name was Grandma. Grandma. And so I know that is true in my own family. I hope it's true in your family. But hopefully you were able to even identify some of the people who are around you right now who are selfless. Here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing is if we were to go to that person and say to them, hey, I want to just acknowledge you and appreciate you for the selfless person that you are. You are always giving and thinking of others first. You are laying down your own rights for the good of others. And if you were to say that to those people, what would most of them say? No, that's not true. I don't do that. It's funny how selflessness and humility seem to somehow be married together. They seem to be married together. Well, today we're going to take a look, at least we're going to start in a book of the Old Testament. It's called 1 Samuel. And so go ahead and open up to 1 Samuel. If you can't find it, it's right before 2 Samuel. Okay, 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel is one of the books of the Bible that we consider one of the historical books. It's not that the whole Bible is not historic, but the Bible is broken up into some different sections or genres, if you will. Some of those are prophetic books. Some of those are poetic books. Some of those are books of the law. This is in a series of books that we would consider to be historical books. And the reason is because we get some of the history of God's interaction with his people, Israel. Okay, so we're going to begin today in 1 Samuel chapter 18. And we'll start in verse 1. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, we'll chat about that in just a minute. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. This wasn't a hostage situation. This was a kindness situation. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan sealed that pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of the war and appointed an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine in this case is the giant Goliath, women from all of the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. This made Saul very angry. What's this? He said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp as he did each day. But Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. A little bit of background here. If we turn back just a page, we would be in 1 Samuel chapter 17, in which we see a story that's very familiar to churchgoers and people who were raised in the church. You probably saw this story played out on a felt board in your Sunday school class. 1 Samuel chapter 17 tells us the story of a boy named David who was the least likely in his family to ever really amount to anything, but who had been anointed by God, who shows up on a battle scene. There's this battle between Israel and the Philistines. And the Philistines have this great, mighty, undefeated giant who does battle for them. He's their champion. Again, a giant, like a literal giant, and he's undefeated. And all of Israel's warriors have pulled back in fear. I'm not going out there. I'm not facing him. I'm not battling him. I'm not dying today. I'm not going to fight him. And here little David comes along, and David says, I'll go. I'll fight him. And it's not because David just has this bravado, or even because David has some sort of ignorance. It's because David has great faith in God. Okay, we can't miss that David has great faith in God. And in fact, if you go back, there's even clues there when David says, hey, why is this guy being allowed to criticize our God? Who's going to step up and defend our God? Like, we can't let this go on. And at one point, they try to put all kinds of armor on him, but the armor's too big, it's too heavy. And David says, I can't wear this. Take this off. I'll go out and fight him, and I'll fight him in the power of our God. For God will deliver us victory. Okay, so I don't want to preach that message, but that's what happened in 17. And it's important for us because in 18, it says here that after David finished talking with Saul. So again, not to get too dark here, but after the battle, David is victorious. He defeats the giant, and he brings an emblem. I know we got kids in here. He brings a symbol of his victory to King Saul. And he says, hey, this proves the giant is done. Ding dong, the witch is dead. And they have this conversation. And again, bless you. Saul, he says, David, thank you. You've done a great thing, and I'm proud of you. And, Israel is blessed, and honor and honor and honor to you. Okay, so after this conversation, now we're in 18, because I'm not preaching the giant today. After this, David met Saul's first son, whose name was Jonathan. And there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. The ESV, English Standard Version, tells the same story, but it uses different language. And I want to read it to you here because the language is more accurate to the actual Hebrew language. It's not that the stories change or that the facts change. It's just that the language is a little more accurate and maybe harder to understand. But I want to read it to you. It goes this way. ESV says, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. I think that translation helps us to understand these were more than like Facebook friends. Jonathan immediately forms this bond that the Bible says his soul was knit to David's soul. Like they became closer than brothers. In fact, there's a proverb that says there is a friend that is closer than a brother. And so they have this friendship that is even tighter than that of brothers. They say that blood is thicker than water. In this case, souls being knit together is even thicker than blood. Now, why is all this relevant? Why does all this matter? Because we've got to pay attention to some things we know about humanity, some things we know even about history. Who is next in line in any kingdom? You have a king, and then if he has a son, his son is next in line. And that would be true by the world standards. Even in this family, you would have King Saul, Israel's first ever king, and his first son his first son Jonathan, and Jonathan would be in line to be king. Now, can we just be honest about humanity? That's a big deal. Some of us have dreamed, some of us have wished that somehow we could just be a little bit more in life. I wish I could be a little bit more popular. I wish I could be a little bit more liked. I wish I could be a little bit more famous. I wish I could have a little bit more power. I wish I could have a little bit more money. I wish I could have a little bit more of something. And rightfully, this is what's due Jonathan. Not just more, dude should be king. You want fame? You want power? You want wealth? You want everything that life can offer? King of a nation. And by the world standards, that is what is rightfully due Jonathan. And Jonathan understands in this moment what's happening. He's not ignorant. He's not lost. He's not deceived. He understands what's happening here is that God has anointed David. And David is going to be the next king of Israel. So I'm going to ask you in your own heart for a moment, in your own heart, not your Sunday morning church heart, your Monday through Saturday heart. If you were Jonathan, how would you feel in this moment? Now, there are some who couldn't let go of their Sunday morning heart, and they were like, Pastor, I would be honored, and I would just lay down my rights before the Lord. There are others who are a little bit more maybe honest, and they were like, I don't really want the responsibilities of being a king anyway, so it wouldn't be a big deal. But listen, most of us here, if we're honest, we would say, this isn't right, this isn't fair, I feel cheated, I was supposed to be king. And here comes David, little punk. What I want us to consider today is Jonathan's heart as one example of what it looks like to love like Jesus commands us to love. And here's what I mean by that. In a series where we're talking about loving the world in a way that they would see us and not be impressed by us, but be impressed by the God who transformed our hearts, to be drawn to the God who gave us new hearts. I want us to talk today about what it looks like to be willing to lay down what we believe or feel is rightfully due us for the good of others. It's a hard thing to do. to lay down what I feel is rightfully due me, I deserve, for the good of others. And we'll see that in this one example, whose name is Jonathan. As I said, Jonathan knew, understood, and had peace with what he was losing. He knew, understood, and had peace with what David was gaining. You're going to hear this word all throughout the series, demonstrated. Jonathan demonstrated amazing selflessness, what I like to call othersness. I know that's not a word, but I love the idea of othersness. Jonathan demonstrated amazing othersness when he willingly laid down what many would argue was rightfully due him and actively worked for the good of another. This may remind you, by the way, of a New Testament passage. You don't have to turn there. It'll be on the screen. But in 1 Corinthians 13, we have that passage on love that you hear at the weddings. In the second half of verse 4 and into verse 5, we read this: love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable. And it keeps no record of being wronged. And I know we can apply this to other areas of our life, but I think we're seeing this in Jonathan. In Jonathan, we see somebody who, he's not jealous. He's not jealous of what he's given up. He's not jealous of what David is receiving. Jonathan is not demanding his own way. Jonathan is not keeping a record of being wronged. In fact, the Bible tells us that Jonathan not only accepted this course, but he embraced it. It says he loved David. In fact, in verses 3 and 4, it said he made a pact. Other translations would say, he made a covenant with David. And here's what it was. The pact, the covenant, he was like, dude, I've got your back for life. For life, man. I love you more than I would love a brother. You are my friend, and I have got your back. I will always be there for you. I will always stand behind you, beside you. I will always be with you. You're my guy. See, Jonathan recognized that this was God's plan. And because Jonathan recognized that this was God's plan, he got on board with it, even though it cost him something. I remember when I was in college, Corey's not up here, Corey's downstairs, but I've made a commitment to Corey that I'm not going to tell any more football stories, because apparently I tell those a lot, so I'm not going to tell any more football stories. But I was also a swimmer. And so, when I was in college, I had a swim coach. And he actually turned out to be more than a coach. He was a good friend to me. And but anyway, my coach, I was a halfway decent swimmer in high school. You know, I had some success, and I was pretty solid in high school. Didn't want to swim in college. Went there to play football. Freshman year, only played football. The swimmer said, hey, you want to be a swimmer? And I was like, no. And then they introduced me to the coach. I hit it off with the coach, and I said, yeah, you know what? I'll play football, and I'll also be a swimmer. And so after a year off, the coach said, well, why don't you come out here and just show me what you got? And so if you're familiar with swimming, everything is about times. And so after a year of lifting weights and getting in better shape, I wasn't sure how I would do, but I got up and I swam my race. And when I finished, it was my best time ever. Best time ever. And I got out of the water, and I was trying to look humble. Like, I was trying my best. But as I walked over to the coach, I was like, he's like, well, what'd you think? And I was like, well, not bad. Waiting for him to embrace me as the next Mark Spitz. But what he said to me is that he said, I want you to forget everything you've ever known. He said, your stroke is horrible. I want you to forget everything you've ever learned, and I'm going to teach you from scratch. So as we began to practice, he started to tell me some things that when he told me, I was like, this dude is crazy. What he's telling me makes no sense. In fact, it's counterintuitive, and I'll probably go backwards. I might sink if I do what this guy's telling me. It'll never work. But because of who he was, because of his position, because of his authority, because of the connection and the trust I had in him, I said, I will do these things that seem ludicrous to me. And I think that's what we see here in Jonathan. I think we see it in many people throughout the scriptures where they say, look, God, the stuff you're telling me to do, it seems crazy. It seems nonsensical. This seems absurd. Why in the world would I ever do that? And then some of them say, but you are God. And because of who you are, because of your authority, your position, because I trust you, I will do this thing. And that's when we see miracles. And I have to think that for Jonathan, even though we don't hear it in verses 1 to 4, somewhere in there, there probably was a very human moment where Jonathan thought, but God, I'm the firstborn son. I'm next in line. I should be the king. But because of who you are, because of your position and your authority, and because I trust you, I will submit to your will. I will set aside what I think is good for me and pursue what you say is good for everyone. And I will work to bless David. And as Christians, there are times in our lives when we're called to do that. God, I'm going to set aside the thing that would make me most happy, or at least the thing that I believe would make me the most happy. I'm going to set that aside because you said I should love my neighbor. I'm going to set that aside because you said greater love has no one than to lay down his life for his friend. I'm going to set that aside, God, because you said I should love others as much as I love myself. I'm going to set those things aside and I'm going to do it your way, God. And when we do that, we see miracles. And that's what this series really is. Now, we also see in King Saul a very human figure. We see in King Saul that the women, the ladies are singing songs, right? They've written songs, and I don't know the exact rhythm or the melody or the harmony or the tempo. I don't know any of that, but somehow their songs are, hey, King Saul has killed 1,000 men, but David has killed 10,000. And by the way, I didn't know this until this week's study. I learned that this was actually not a slight against King Saul. In fact, in Hebrew poetry, and if you want examples, you can go to the Proverbs, and you'll find that oftentimes in Hebrew literature, they double down on something. And so what they'll say, for example, in this case is, King Saul killed 1,000 men, and, not however, and David, who's his servant, has killed 10,000. So it's like, hey, King Saul has done this, and David's done this, and great is our God. So they double down, but because of Saul's heart, because Saul is selfish, because Saul is self-centered, because Saul is jealous and paranoid, what we see here is that Saul gets angry. He doesn't hear the song that way. In fact, he even says, what is this? They're singing songs about, I only killed 1,000, but David killed 10,000. What is this? And then he says, look, as long as this dude's around, he's going to be a thorn in my side. As long as this dude's around, he's going to be a threat to my throne. As long as this dude's around, he's going to be a frown on my face. Got to get rid of him. I got to get rid of him. In fact, I don't know if you heard it, but in verse 8, we heard that Saul became jealous And in verse 10, Saul behaved like a madman. And oh, by the way, because of his heart, because of his hardened heart, because of the way that he was pursuing this whole situation, God actually sent a spirit of a spirit of hardness, a spirit of torment, and I can't have peace. Like God was like, okay, this is how you're going to be. I'll give you steroids for it. And it says here that as a result, Saul began to behave like a madman, so much so that, listen to this, second half of verse 10 and into verse 11, but Saul had a spear in his hand. David, by the way, at this point is playing a musical instrument. At one point in previous chapters, Saul couldn't find rest. He couldn't sleep. He's like, oh my goodness, I can't find any peace. And so they bring David, and David starts writing songs and playing this instrument. And when he does, it gives Saul peace, and Saul's able to just close his eyes and finally go to sleep. And so David is playing a musical instrument like he had done many, many, many times before. But as Saul is wrapped up in his own head and thinking about this situation, and I don't know, maybe he's even a little bit mad that his son's not going to be king. It doesn't say that. It says he's really worried about his own throne. But I wonder, as a dad, I wonder if maybe there's a little bit of bitterness that, what about my legacy? What about my progeny? What about our family name? Like, I wonder, maybe that could be there. But what I do know is this. He had a spear in his hand. And while David played the music, Saul suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. So Saul, this madness overcomes him. His jealousy, his anger, his whatever he's feeling, it overcomes him to the point where he picks up the spear and he throws it at David, intending to put it through his chest and pin him to the wall. And then we read this, but David escaped. Period? Twice. So apparently this happened more than once. Just as a side note, sermon for another day, not for today. You've heard the phrase that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Don't we see this oftentimes with people who get power, people that get authority? Not always, but oftentimes what happens is they become so obsessed with their own power, with their own authority, that they are willing to stoop to evil to maintain it. Second sermon for another day, and this should give you some encouragement. This should give you some hope. I know that there are people in our church and abroad who feel like there is a family history. There are these family dynamics that our family has. There are generations of brokenness. And we see certain things, maybe it's abuse, maybe it's alcoholism, maybe it's divorce, maybe it's whatever it is. We see these things just going down from generation to generation to generation to generation. And I just feel like our family's doomed. I feel like we're never going to break this. But let me tell you this. Jonathan is Saul's son. And as an encouragement today, man, let me just tell you, no matter how broken Saul was, no matter how hard and fast Saul tried to run from the Lord, Jonathan had a heart for God. And because of his heart for God, he broke that cycle. I don't know if you needed to hear that today. All right, so if we continue through 1 Samuel, what we're going to find out is that Saul tries 4 more times to kill David. 4 other times he tries to kill David. And I'm going to draw your attention now to 1 Samuel 19. Okay, you turn there. I'm going to get a quick sip here. This is my communion grape juice. Or Mountain Dew. Okay, 1 Samuel 19, verses 4 and 5. So Saul, he's engaged. He's ready to go after David again. He's going to go after David again. He wants to get rid of David, got to kill David. And listen to what Jonathan does. The boy who could have felt cheated, I should say young man, the young man who could have behaved in lots of different ways. Here's what he does with his dad. Verse 4, 19:4. The next morning, Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. The king must not sin against his servant David, Jonathan said. He's never done anything to harm you. He's always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant and how the Lord brought a great victory to all Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There's no reason for it at all. I see two things here. One of them is this. I know that there have been times in my life, especially as a younger man with less maturity and before God had really begun to morph my heart, there were times when I would be in a group and the group would start to rail against somebody. And quite honestly, I may not have even had a dog in that race. I may not have even really cared, but when the group began to rail against that person, guess what I did? Yeah, I jumped right on that train. I jumped right on that train and I spoke evil against that person, sometimes maybe to benefit myself, and other times maybe not, just maybe to be a part of the group in some fashion or something. And I think this is sometimes what humans can do. I don't personally have social media accounts, but I have heard that it happens there. Can anyone confirm? And so sometimes we'll jump on board, and there are other times when I would very quickly jump on board if I saw a clear advantage or something that I might get for sure. So if I can jump onto a group of people who are railing against a particular individual and that thing might benefit me, oh yeah, I would have jumped right in and been like, dude, you don't even know the half of it. Let me tell you. Let me tell you about some things you don't even know. I'm going to tell you about this and this and this and this. And I'm going to really paint the picture for you about how awful that person is, and then somehow maybe it would benefit me. Jonathan could have done that here. He so easily could have been like, Dad, you're so right. You are so right. This kid is a pain in the neck. He's got his eye on the throne, like he's going to mess up the legacy. He could have done that, but he didn't. Jonathan goes to bat for David. Jonathan says, Dad, slow down, man, slow down. And by the way, wouldn't it be better if we were that type of people? What if we were the type of people who instead of jumping on the train to bash, jumped on the train to defend? What if you're like, hey, whoa, press the brakes on that, man. Press the brakes. He's actually not a bad guy. She's actually not that bad of a person. In fact, there's some goodness in her. Do you remember the time she did this? Do you remember the time the guy did that? What if we went to bat and defended one another? Then we get to 1 Samuel 20, and Jonathan goes to bat yet again for David. This time they cook up a scheme because David is in trouble again. So here's a quick summary. You can read it for yourself. But essentially, Jonathan wants to test the waters to see how angry Saul still is about David. Does Saul still want to kill David? David's been off and hiding. David is away. And so Saul asks, hey, I'm having a gathering for all my leaders. David's one of the leaders. He should be here. Where's David? And Jonathan says, oh, listen, he had some family business. He had to go back home. He had to tend to the family business. And the test was, if this enraged Saul, if this made Saul lose his mind, then Jonathan would know for sure Saul still has a grudge against David. And so what we see in chapter 20 is Saul loses his mind. He hears about this thing, and he absolutely loses his mind. In fact, if you don't mind, I'll share with you. In verse 20, in chapter 20, I'll start in verse 30. I don't have these, Tom, so I'm just going to read them out of the Bible here. Chapter 20, starting in verse 30. Saul boiled with rage at Jonathan. So now he's mad at his son. You're defending David? You've somehow colluded, like you okayed this? You said he could go home for family business? So he boiled with rage at Jonathan. Listen to this. You stupid son of a whore. He swore at him. Do you think I don't know that you want him to be king in your place? Shaming yourself and your mother? You're a disappointment to our whole family. Your mother would be ashamed. You ought to be ashamed, you son of a... Verse 31. As long as that son of Jesse, that's David, is alive, You'll never be king. Now go and get him so I can kill him. Verse 32. But why should he be put to death? Jonathan asked his father. What has he done? This is now the 5th time that Saul wants to kill David. And even though Jonathan has just seen his dad lose his mind and say some scarring words, Jonathan's response is, but why are you mad at David? He hadn't done anything against you, Dad. Now, you want evidence that Saul had turned into a madman? Verse 32. Then Saul hurled his spear at his own son, Jonathan, intending to kill him. You thought your family dinners could get contentious. When's the last time somebody picked up a fork and chucked it across the room? Bible's full of real people, isn't it? Real people. Here's a guy who starts out by saying to his kid, every ugly thing, and you're not going to be king. Which reveals his heart. His heart is that he wants his son to one day be king. So he hurls a spear intending to kill his son. I'm pretty sure we can call that insanity. Which, by the way, there's a message in that too. When you continue to rebel against the Lord and rebel against the Lord and rebel against the Lord and rebel against the Lord, you can actually get to a place where you behave like a madman. You can get to a place where you lose sanity. You can get to a place where the only hope you've got for recovery is to return to the Lord. Matthew 22, 37 through 39, you don't have to turn there because you know this passage. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. As yourself. Have you heard about anyone today who loved his neighbor as himself? That would be Jonathan. In fact, the scripture used those words. Jonathan loved David as his own soul. Philippians 2, 3, and 4 say this. They'll be on the screen for you. And really, this is what we're talking about in our message and in our series. It says here, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others. This is so contrary to the age in which we live, but quite frankly, it's contrary to every age. There is a part of humanity that we are just born with that is me. Me and I. Right? We know that. We can watch kids who haven't been taught anything yet, and the way that they behave and the way that they interact with each other, and oftentimes we'll see some very selfish, doesn't mean we never see kindness, but we can often see some very selfish, egotistical, demanding behaviors. And I want to focus on verse 4 for a minute because it says, don't look out only for your own interests. Look, the point of the message today is not that you should be a whipping boy, that you should just be a complete victim. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say don't look out for your own interest. It said don't look out only for your own interest. Of course you've got to look out for your own interest. Of course you've got to, in some ways, take care of yourself and manage your own life. Protect yourself and the ones you love. But additionally, we have to look out for others' interests too, such that they would at least be equal to our own, or as the verse started, thinking of others as better than yourselves. All right, I'm going to start to wrap up here. I want you to circle back, if you will. Not yet, Sean. Circle back, if you will, to the very beginning where we were at today in 1 Samuel 18. Okay, we're going to circle back there as we begin to close. In verse 4, 1 Samuel 18, verse 4, we read something that I really didn't press down on at the time, but I'm going to press down on it now. Jonathan sealed the pact. He made a covenant with David. I got your back. I'm your guy. I'm with you for life. Okay? I think there's a phrase like we're road dogs or something like that, whatever that phrase is. That's me trying to be cool. 18:4. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Okay. Now, before we go any further, this is not like some naked thing. That's not what it's about. And by the way, I bring that up strategically because there is a part of our culture today that uses this passage that I'm preaching as an endorsement of homosexuality. That what we see here is that David and Jonathan were actually lovers. Okay? That's not what this passage is, but in this particular case, it says here that Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. What was that all about? Why would he do that? Huh? It's not just a sign that they're brothers. No. These are Jonathan's princely garments. These are the indicators that Jonathan is the king's son. These are the indicators that Jonathan is next in line to be king. This is Jonathan abdicating his throne. This is Jonathan saying, dude, I recognize God's call on your life. This robe that is a sign of royalty, you wear it. My tunic, my bow, my belt, you put them on. You wear these as a sign that you are next in line. And here's what I love about that. Sean, now you can bring your gang up. What I love about that is it's not the only time we see it in Scripture. They're going to walk up here. You're going to get distracted, especially by the crutch. But I want you to stay with me. Do you remember the story of the prodigal father, the prodigal son? In more modern Bibles, they call this the story of the lost son. Stay with me here. And I like that name better because most people don't even know what prodigal means. But the idea is that there was a son who had wandered away from his father, right? If you know that story, you know there's a point of humility where the son realizes, my life is garbage away from my father. I've pursued my own desires, my own way, and it's all kind of fallen apart on me. And so I want to return to my father. And so the son comes home, and when he gets there with this elaborate apology ready for his dad, he doesn't even get to utter the words, I'm sorry, before his father runs out into the field to meet him, embraces him with this massive hug, probably breaks down into tears, and he literally says, my son who is dead to me is now alive. Like my son who was dead is resurrected to life, and we are in a restored relationship. And then he says, and I think I have it here, Luke 15, but his father said to the servants, quick, bring him the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. Here again, what we see is that this father is clothing his son. He's clothing him in symbolic garments that say, we are restored. We are together. You are right with me. You are the heir to my promises. You are the heir to what I have to offer. In fact, you're the heir to my little kingdom. And then there's one other example I want to bring to your attention today. And if you don't know it, you'll see it here in just a minute. This idea of putting robes on people, whether it's Jonathan putting his princely robe on David, or the prodigal father giving his robe to his son. We also see it here in Isaiah 61:10. In Isaiah 61:10, we read this. I am overwhelmed with joy in the Lord my God, for he has dressed me with the clothing of salvation and draped me in a robe of righteousness. I am like a bridegroom dressed for his wedding, or a bride with her jewels. Revelation 7, 9 through 10 say this: after I, John, who's got this vision in heaven, after this I saw a vast crowd, too many to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in front of the throne and before the Lamb. That is the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ, the one who was slain to take away the sins of the world and resurrected. They were clothed in white robes and held palm branches, symbols of victory, in their hands. And they were shouting with a great roar, salvation comes from our God who sits on the throne and from the Lamb. If I could tie these ideas together today of incredible selflessness, of laying down what you think is due you for the good of others, and putting on white robes, or white robes being given to you, I want to finish with this. Philippians 2, 5 through 8 read this way: you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. He laid down what was rightfully his. He laid it down so that you and I might receive good. It goes on. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. And when he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on the cross. You may remember that when Jesus died on that cross, he was stripped naked. He died on that cross naked. But I want to tell you something today. While he was naked on the cross, believer, if you have trusted in Jesus Christ for your salvation, though he was naked, you are now clothed in the blood of Christ. You are wrapped in robes of righteousness, in right relationship with your Father in heaven. We wear that robe proudly, humbly, gratefully, joyfully. And because we wear that robe, we too, by the power of the Holy Spirit, can now be selfless, laying down what we think belongs to us for the good of others. That's the call of the church. Today's the first Sunday of the month, a day that at Grace Fellowship Church we take communion. And it's a time when we pause to remember, to give praise and thanks to God who left heaven, who laid down what was rightfully his, to step into the world and die a criminal's death, naked on a cross, to clothe you in the blood, to wrap you in his righteousness. So Janine, you and I are going to pass out the elements up front today. I think Will's going to take them to the back. We're going to invite you in a moment to start coming up row by row as the worship team leads a song of worship. And once everyone receives those elements, we'll wait at our seats. We'll take a break. We'll receive those together. And then after that, we'll conclude with one final song of praise and worship to our great God in heaven.